Guys, my name is David Spence. I read U.S. Media and Migration, Oral Histories from Refugees. Very interesting book. I'll admit I wasn't looking forward to it at first, but after digging into it, it was actually pretty engrossing, and I ended up reading it in one night. It's about 150 pages of reading with a lot of really well-sourced notes in there, but a very interesting book. And so what it covers is refugees that are being resettled to the United States and the media that they consume before, during, and after the resettlement process. And so it's very interesting in the way that their perception of American culture was influenced by media, both before, during, and after their immigration. And so a couple things that I want to define up front so that the rest of the video makes sense. So a refugee is somebody that's forced to immigrate, that they fear persecution for cultural, ethnic, religious reasons back in their home country, and so they actually apply for refugee status, are accepted into a host country, and then move to that new country. And so these aren't people that voluntarily immigrate, that a lot of times they're forced to. The second thing is that media can be any type of media. This book specifically dealt with American media, and so that includes newspapers, it's videos that they watched online, if they had access to the internet, DVDs, VHSs, anything that they can consume that provides information about American culture. The book's divided into 4 chapters, and it covers the 4 stages of media acquisition that the refugees would have encountered. The first stage would be incidental media that they watched or consumed that had to deal with America, but that they didn't know they were going to immigrate to America at the stage that they watched it or consumed it. So this would be kids in the neighborhood watching DVDs of American movies, or watching music videos online, and this is before they even know they're going to the United States. So this is just exposure that they have before they're being resettled. Then she really goes in depth with refugees that she's talking to. She interviewed hundreds of refugees that had recently resettled to the United States, and so she does in-depth interviews with each of these people about these 4 stages, and so she has a very good perspective on their media usage before they even knew they were going to immigrate. And most of them had some access to American culture through media prior to immigrating. There were a few that didn't, and then didn't even know America existed, which I was kind of dumbfounded by. But apparently, in extremely impoverished areas, that's likely, especially Somalia, it seems. So that was the first chapter, kind of analyzing how that media influenced their perceptions, and I'll get into what the conclusions were a bit later. The second chapter dealt with media that they viewed on willingly when they knew that they were going to go to the United States, and so they were trying to educate themselves as much as they possibly could, in most cases, so that they could figure out what America was going to be like, what our culture was, what was acceptable, what wasn't acceptable. And so there were a lot of refugees that really endeavored to learn more about the United States beyond just what's mandated by the U.S. State Department or the UN Resettlement Program. And that was chapter 3, was that media which was required by the State Department, who's responsible for refugee resettlement in the U.S., or the UN. And these refugees would watch that before they immigrated as a acclimation to the United States, and then they would also, once they immigrated, have a curriculum in many cases that they followed that would help them get adjusted to their new life in America. And then the 4th chapter covered media that they're going to view after they're in the United States, after they've settled in a little bit, but that they may encounter in their day-to-day life. They may seek it out, they may just encounter it, but it's a constant process of learning more about your host country's culture, and that doesn't stop until you die. So this is media that they've watched every day until now, basically, since they came to the United States. And so that was the 4 chapters, how she broke it up kind of chronologically, which I thought was very useful. She didn't really draw conclusions. That's something that's important to note. This was more of an analysis, and it didn't. The focus was not on making a point or something like that. It was very much a rhetorical analysis. And her goal was clearly to examine these refugees' experience and see how media influenced them. And in many cases, it actually had a positive impact, giving them a perspective of the United States and some of our day-to-day interactions that was helpful for them once they actually arrived. Now, there were also aspects of our media that kind of damaged their perception of the United States, or at least gave them an incorrect perception that they had to overcome once they arrived. If all they saw were action movies, as a few refugees from Iraq and Somalia did, then their understanding of the United States was that we were a very unpredictable and combative people. And though I'm sure that's true in some areas, that's not our culture as a whole. We don't necessarily promote that on an individual level, even if Hollywood may. And so these refugees, when they arrived, they had to overcome that because that's what they believed. They were scared to go outside. One of them expressed fear of going to the supermarket because I guess he'd seen a thriller that took place in a supermarket. And so as they learned more about the culture, as they continued to acclimate to the United States, they figured out that this wasn't accurate. And there were also refugees that thought the United States was much more prosperous, and that their life would be a lot easier than it actually ended up being once they arrived. And so that was kind of the opposite. Instead of thinking the country was a lot worse than it was and then being pleasantly surprised when they arrived, it was the inverse. They thought it was a lot better than it was, and when they arrived, they realized they had to work really hard just for the basic necessities in life. And so there were kind of two ends of the spectrum there, which I found interesting. If you think about it, it makes sense, but I hadn't thought about it before. So the book has a number of strengths. The first strength that I really found to be the most valuable was that she went to the source. She wasn't reading scientific journals or talking to State Department officials. She actually talked to the refugees themselves who had immigrated to the United States. And that was just invaluable because throughout the book you're getting quotes from these refugees at paragraph length, very, very broken English in some cases, and so it's authentic. You know that these people recently immigrated, which is the second strength, and it's valuable information from the source. It's not filtered. And so, as I said, the second strength is that these are people that recently immigrated, because if you're looking at a refugee from the 1990s, it's a very, very different scenario than the post-9/11 America and even the post-9/11 world. And so most of her refugees immigrated in the last 10 years. And so that's very important because they went through the current or mostly current refugee process, resettlement process. They had to go through whatever culture they were into, the modern American culture. And so I found it valuable because we aren't talking about refugees that came when it was a more or less a simple process to immigrate to the United States. These are people that came through the current process where we're concerned about terrorism and into our current culture. And our culture in the 90s was different than it is now, even if we've retained some of the same things. So those were two of the strengths, the first-hand accounts and then the recency of all of the refugee resettlements. The only weakness that I could really think of was I found myself not being able to identify with some of the refugees that came up multiple times in the book. And so she would reference a name I can't pronounce from Iraq. He immigrated from Baghdad with his family. And he apparently talked a lot because she referenced and quoted him multiple times in the book, different chapters. But I found it difficult to maintain any consistency with who he was or anything. I would love if she included a bio, maybe an appendix or something like that, of just some of the more common refugees that she references, so that I can look at them, understand a little bit about who they are, where they came from, when they immigrated, and things like that. Because I did have to flip back 5 or 6 pages to figure out, okay, this guy immigrated in 2007, he's from Baghdad, etc. But really, that's a minor weakness, I think. Overall, very interesting book. Highly recommend it if you're in any kind of intercultural communication class, interested in refugee resettlement or immigration, and just recommend that you not worry too much about any subjectivity on the author's part. She did a very good job of being objective, acknowledging the points at which she might be subjective, or where her personal opinion may play in. But overall, outstanding book. Highly recommend it.